In the late 18th century, no colony in the Atlantic world looked more profitable, more dazzling, or more violently successful than Saint-Domingue. The western third of the island of Hispaniola, ruled by France, had become a place where sugar, coffee, indigo, cotton, and wealth poured outward toward Europe in astonishing quantities. French merchants, planters, insurers, investors, shipowners, and state officials all understood that this colony mattered beyond its size. It was not merely one possession among many. It was the brightest jewel in a commercial empire built on coercion, shipment, and appetite. To read the ledgers of the age is to see Saint-Domingue everywhere. To look beneath those ledgers is to see a society balanced on terror. The fields that made Saint-Domingue rich were worked by enslaved Africans and African-descended people on a scale that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to slavery. The enslaved population vastly outnumbered the free. By the eve of revolution, roughly 500,000 enslaved people labored under an order maintained by the whip, the gun, the chain, the patrol, the legal code, and the expectation that life could be expended to satisfy the global market. Mortality was so severe that planters repeatedly imported new captives rather than rely on natural increase. The colony consumed human beings as if they were fuel. New arrivals from Africa, speaking many languages, carrying many memories, and thrown into the same machine of production, found themselves forced into one of the harshest plantation systems on earth. Saint-Domingue was not simply rich because it used enslaved labor. It was rich because it pushed that labor with extraordinary intensity, and because Europe and North America alike bought what that intensity produced. This documentary is about the revolution that shattered that world. It is about enslaved people who turned the wealthiest slave colony in the Atlantic into the first durable Black republic in the modern world. It is about the revolution that destroyed slavery in Saint-Domingue, broke one of the great plantation systems of the age, defeated armies sent by Europe's most powerful states, forced the Atlantic powers to reckon with a possibility they had long treated as unthinkable, and changed the political history of the Americas. It is about the Haitian Revolution. To call it a slave uprising is true, but incomplete. To call it an anti-colonial war is true, but incomplete. To call it a social revolution is true, but incomplete. The Haitian Revolution was all of these things at once, unfolding across more than a decade of extraordinary violence, improvisation, diplomacy, ideological struggle, and military invention. It began in a slave society fractured not only between enslaved and free, but among whites, among free people of color, among imperial officials, among men who invoked the rights of man while denying them to others, among enslaved communities whose experiences of African origin, plantation labor, creolization, and resistance were not identical. The revolution did not rise from simplicity. It rose from contradiction. That contradiction made Saint-Domingue a profoundly unstable place even before the word revolution echoed from Paris across the Atlantic. The colony was stratified and brittle. White planters and officials were not a single block. Some were Grand Blancs, wealthy planters and commercial elites jealous of metropolitan interference and protective of their power. Some were Petit Blancs, poorer whites, artisans, overseers, clerks, soldiers, and petty functionaries who often clung fiercely to racial status as compensation for limited wealth. Free people of color, many of them property owners and some slaveholders themselves, occupied an intermediate legal and social position, denied full equality with whites but not reduced to slavery. They had long pressed for greater civil rights, and the contradictions of French imperial ideology sharpened their claims. Beneath and beyond these categories were the enslaved majority, the people whose labor sustained the colony and whose fear haunted every free household. Plantation order depended on more than legal inequality. It depended on surveillance, fragmentation, and the hope among slaveholders that the enslaved would remain too divided by language, birthplace, distance, and punishment to coordinate at scale. Yet plantation society also generated the networks that would one day help destroy it. Fields, markets, roads, work gangs, maroon communities, kinship ties, religious practices, urban movement, and the constant circulation of rumor created channels through which information could travel even in a world designed to suppress it. Resistance in Saint-Domingue did not appear from nowhere in 1791. It had a prehistory of flight, poisoning panics, sabotage, maroonage, local conspiracies, and daily refusals. The planters' wealth rested not on consent, but on domination, and domination always leaves behind a counter-history of endurance and resistance. The colony's demographic reality made the fear of uprising permanent. White colonists knew they were heavily outnumbered. So did free people of color. So did imperial officials. The memory of enslaved rebellion, whether real, rumored, or projected from other colonies, lingered constantly in the political imagination of slave societies. Patrols, punishments, and displays of exemplary violence were meant not only to discipline the enslaved, but to soothe the free with the fantasy that terror could guarantee safety. But terror does not remove fear from a slave regime. It deepens it. In Saint-Domingue, every planter household lived with the knowledge that the system's profitability rested on a demographic and moral abyss. This is why the Haitian Revolution struck so deeply at the Atlantic world. It did not merely replace one government with another. It overturned an entire structure of expectation. Across Europe and the Americas, slaveholders, merchants, reformers, imperial officials, and revolutionaries had all been learning to think of plantation slavery as one of the fixed engines of Atlantic prosperity. Saint-Domingue was one of its greatest engines. When revolution came there, it threatened not just local elites, but a whole way of imagining wealth, race, empire, and order. To understand why the Haitian Revolution became so explosive, we have to begin with another revolution that at first did not seem to be about Saint-Domingue at all. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted in metropolitan France, and with it came an extraordinary language of sovereignty, rights, citizenship, nation, and the legitimacy of political transformation. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen did not automatically free a single enslaved person in the colonies. It did not even settle how colonial subjects would be incorporated into the new constitutional order. But it did something almost as dangerous from the perspective of the old regime. It destabilized every inherited justification for hierarchy by forcing people to ask whether principles proclaimed in Paris applied beyond Paris. Who, exactly, counted as a man in the rights of man? Who counted as a citizen? Did colonial assemblies enjoy autonomy like provinces of the nation? Did free men of color possess the same civil and political rights as white colonists? Could planters invoke liberty against metropolitan regulation while continuing to deny liberty to the enslaved? Could the National Assembly claim universal principle while treating the colonies as exceptional spaces where those principles must stop? These were not academic questions. They became immediate political weapons. White colonists in Saint-Domingue often embraced revolutionary language selectively. Many wanted greater colonial autonomy and freer trade. They objected to metropolitan control. They liked rights when rights strengthened their local authority. But they had no intention of applying equality across racial lines or threatening slavery itself. Petits Blancs, meanwhile, often feared that any extension of rights to free men of color would weaken the one status that still gave poor whites social power. Free people of color seized the rhetoric of the French Revolution and pressed their claim to equal citizenship with increasing insistence, pointing out the hypocrisy of proclaiming universal rights while maintaining racial exclusion. In Paris, colonial lobbyists and abolitionist critics battled over representation, commerce, and the status of colonial subjects. The revolution in France did not simply travel to Saint-Domingue as a finished package. It arrived as a destabilizing argument whose meaning could be fought over by every group with something to lose or gain. Free people of color occupied a particularly crucial position in this struggle. Many were property owners, militia members, educated, Catholic, and deeply embedded in colonial life. Some had served the colony militarily. Some owned slaves. They were not a revolutionary proletariat in any simple sense, but they knew the humiliation of legal discrimination and social exclusion. Men like Julian Raymond and Vincent Augué demanded civil equality for free men of color, invoking both natural rights and their stake in the colony. Augué's 1790 uprising, though quickly crushed and ending in his brutal execution, revealed how combustible the rights question had already become. White colonists could not concede equality without threatening the racial order they believed essential. Free people of color could not simply forget what the French Revolution had taught them to say about citizenship. The colony was moving toward a collision before the enslaved majority had even entered the political foreground as an organized force. And then the enslaved did enter the foreground, and everything changed. In August 1791, in the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, one of the most consequential slave uprisings in modern history began. The exact chain of organization, religious ceremony, rumor, and planning behind the opening of the revolt has long fascinated historians, in part because slaveholders and officials had every incentive to describe the uprising in ways that made it seem foreign, irrational, monstrous, or magically inexplicable rather than politically intelligible. The famous ceremony at Bois Cayman, associated in revolutionary memory with duty boukman and collective oath, occupies a powerful symbolic place even if historians continue to debate details. What matters beyond any single scene is that the enslaved in the northern province organized on a scale far beyond what the colonial order believed possible. Plantations burned. Slaveholders were killed. Fields became battlefields. A social world built on the assumption of black subordination found itself confronted by black military and political action on a vast scale. The uprising did not erupt into a vacuum. It drew on existing networks among the enslaved, on African military and political experience carried across the Middle Passage, on local leadership, on plantation geographies, on the instability unleashed by the French Revolution, and on the weakness and division of colonial authorities. It was not mindless destruction. It was violent, often spectacularly so, but violence in slave societies always exists against a backdrop of prior violence by the regime itself. To free people confronting a system that recognized their labor, movement, kinship, and lives only under coercion, the destruction of plantations was not merely rage. It was the attack on an institution. For white colonists, the uprising looked apocalyptic. The Northern Plain, one of the richest plantation zones in the colony, became a landscape of burning estates, flight, and fear. For free people of color, the revolt complicated an already dangerous political contest with whites because the field of struggle had suddenly widened beyond civil equality into social revolution. For imperial authorities, the crisis posed impossible questions: how to restore order in a colony divided by race, class, and now large-scale slave war, while metropolitan France itself lurched through revolutionary transformation. For the enslaved, the uprising opened a horizon no one could fully control. Once armed insurrection reached this scale, the problem was no longer whether the plantation regime could be morally justified. The problem was whether it could be physically restored. At this stage, the revolution had not yet become Haiti. It had not yet even become a single coherent movement with one leadership, one ideology, or one agreed goal. Different insurgent leaders pursued different strategies. Some sought freedom and local power more than abstract nationhood. Some negotiated when useful. Some aligned temporarily with outside powers. Some imagined a reordered colony rather than total separation from France. The years ahead would see rapid shifts in allegiance among actors who were constantly recalculating under pressure. One of the dangers in telling this story is to read later Haitian independence back into 1791 as if it were always obvious. It was not. The revolution would travel through monarchy, republicanism, emancipation, imperial war, black generalship, constitutional experimentation, and anti-colonial independence before arriving at a new state. Among the figures who would come to dominate that journey, none would loom larger than Toussaint Louverture. But in 1791, he was not yet the towering statesman of later memory. He emerged from the upheaval rather than stepping into it fully formed. Born enslaved, later free, literate, experienced in plantation management, deeply shaped by Catholicism, by the colony's social complexity, and by a remarkable capacity for political and military adaptation, Toussaint would become one of the most extraordinary leaders of the Revolutionary Age. Yet his rise only makes sense against the breakdown of Saint-Domingue itself. He became possible because the old order was cracking and because he possessed the discipline, strategic patience, and intelligence to move within a world where almost every alliance was provisional. The early years of the uprising unfolded amid a wider war of empires. Spain, controlling the eastern side of Hispaniola at Santo Domingo, and Britain, always eager to weaken French power and exploit colonial chaos. Both became crucial actors. France itself moved through rapid metropolitan change. Monarchy collapsing, republic declared, factions rising and falling, commissioners sent out, policies reversed, and the meaning of empire remade under pressure. Saint-Domingue thus became a revolutionary war inside an imperial war inside a social revolution. No one actor controlled the whole map. Power was fragmented and unstable. This environment created the conditions in which military skill and political flexibility mattered as much as ideology. In 1792 and 1793, French commissioners in the colony, most importantly Ledger Félicite Sonthonax and Etienne Polverel, faced an impossible task. They were sent to enforce metropolitan decrees and stabilize colonial order, including measures relating to free people of color, but they arrived in a situation already spinning into civil war. White colonists resisted. Free people of color mobilized. Slave insurgency continued. Foreign powers loomed. The commissioners, radicals in the context of colonial politics, increasingly found themselves pushed toward emancipation not because they had entered the colony as abolitionist saints, but because military and political necessity narrowed their options. To save French authority in Saint-Domingue, they began to arm formerly enslaved men and offer freedom. This culminated in the dramatic emancipation decrees of 1793 in the colony, followed in 1794 by the French National Convention's abolition of slavery in all French territories. That moment is one of the great turning points in the Age of Revolution. France, under intense pressure and in the midst of wider war, became the first major European power to abolish slavery formally across its empire. It did so in large part because events in Saint-Domingue had made the old colonial logic untenable. The enslaved had forced themselves into politics as a military and moral fact. The revolution in the colony had changed the French Revolution itself. For the insurgent leaders, French abolition transformed the strategic landscape. Toussaint Louverture, who had previously fought aligned with Spain against French authorities, now shifted allegiance to Republican France once emancipation offered a real basis for collaboration. This move was characteristic of Toussaint at his sharpest. He was neither mindlessly loyal nor blindly nationalist in a modern sense. He understood that freedom for the formerly enslaved needed protection within structures that could survive war. If France under the Republic now offered abolition while Spain and Britain appeared more likely to restore slavery or manipulate black fighters for imperial ends, then France became the more useful ally, at least for a time. This decision would help make Toussaint the central military force in Saint-Domingue. Over the following years, he proved himself a commander of exceptional effectiveness. He fought not merely with courage, but with operational sophistication. He understood terrain, supply, morale, diplomacy, and the value of discipline among troops drawn from revolutionary upheaval. He also understood the weakness of European armies in tropical war. Disease, above all yellow fever, ravaged foreign troops. Climate itself became part of the struggle, not as mystical explanation, but as biological reality. European powers could send fleets and battalions. Saint-Domingue could answer with resistance, local knowledge, and a disease environment deadly to outsiders. British intervention deepened the international stakes. Britain saw in the chaos of Saint-Domingue both a chance to cripple France and an opportunity to secure a colony of staggering value. British policymakers and colonial elites could imagine restoring plantation production under their own flag, profiting from France's weakness, and perhaps containing the revolutionary danger by reasserting a slave regime under new management. What they encountered instead was one of the most punishing imperial miscalculations of the era. British forces took some ports and won local support from certain white planters and other anti-French elements. But they entered a colony whose social order had already been shattered and whose formerly enslaved fighters were becoming more coordinated under leaders with local legitimacy. Add yellow fever to determined resistance, and the result was catastrophe. Thousands of British soldiers died. The campaign consumed money, men, and confidence. Saint-Domingue, imagined as a prize, became a grave. Toussaint's ascent occurred within this wider field of conflict. By the mid-1790s, he was consolidating authority not only through battlefield success, but through political calculation. He wrote letters, negotiated, managed officers, and presented himself as both a defender of emancipation and a guarantor of order. This combination was crucial. Planter societies often portray slave revolt as chaos because the possibility of formerly enslaved people exercising disciplined political authority threatens the racial logic of slavery itself. Toussaint understood that to secure freedom, he would have to demonstrate not only military power, but governmental competence. He could not simply destroy the plantation world and walk away from the economic realities of the colony. Saint-Domingue's wealth had been built through export agriculture, and any post-slavery order would have to confront the question of labor, production, and trade. That question haunted the revolution from the beginning. How do you abolish slavery in a plantation colony whose infrastructure, landholding patterns, and connection to the world market had been built around coerced labor? Freedom from chattel slavery did not automatically answer what agricultural work would look like the next season, who would control land, who would profit, or how a war-torn colony would sustain itself materially. Toussaint and other leaders would repeatedly confront this problem. Their solutions often emphasized disciplined labor, plantation production under new arrangements, and state supervision. To later critics, this could look uncomfortably close to coercion. To contemporaries trying to prevent total collapse and foreign conquest, it could look unavoidable. The Haitian Revolution was always both a liberation struggle and a struggle over what liberation could mean in a plantation economy. The racial and class tensions among the free were also far from resolved. Free people of color who had long fought for civil equality did not automatically share the same social vision as the newly emancipated masses. White planters, when not fleeing or collaborating with foreign powers, often sought restoration or influence. French commissioners pursued their own agendas. Black generals emerged with local bases of authority and could be rivals as well as allies. Figures like André Rigaud in the South represented regional and social interests that would later clash sharply with Toussaint. The revolution did not replace one hierarchy with pure solidarity. It produced new contests over power in a radically altered society. Toussaint's achievement in the later 1790s was to move through these contests with unusual dexterity. He defeated or marginalized rivals, pushed back the British, and increasingly positioned himself as the indispensable strongman of Saint-Domingue. By 1798, the British, bloodied and frustrated, were withdrawing. For the Atlantic world, this was already astonishing. A colony long imagined as the secure core of plantation wealth had become a place where Black revolutionary leadership could outlast and outfight a major European empire. The implications of that fact spread far beyond Saint-Domingue. Slave societies everywhere took notice, some with terror, some with admiration, some with a mixture they could barely admit. If Britain learned one lesson from Saint-Domingue, it was that armed intervention in a revolution driven by emancipation could not be treated as ordinary colonial warfare. Disease, terrain, and political legitimacy mattered too much. The more the British appeared as allies of slaveholders or restorers of an old order, the more difficult it became for them to recruit lasting loyalty among the majority who had destroyed that order with their own hands. Empire could seize a fort or a port. It could not easily reverse a social revolution once too many people had armed themselves around freedom. Meanwhile, the French Directory, and later Napoleon Bonaparte, looked at Saint-Domingue through a different but related lens. Revolutionary France had abolished slavery, but metropolitan politics were unstable, and colonial questions remained entangled with commerce and strategic rivalry. Toussaint, formerly serving France, became increasingly autonomous in practice. He corresponded abroad, managed civil administration, appointed officials, and negotiated from strength. To some French observers, he was the savior of the colony under republican principles. To others, he looked dangerously independent, perhaps already too close to being a sovereign in all but name. The old racial assumptions of empire did not disappear because France had voted abolition. They remained embedded in the way many metropolitan policymakers imagined authority. The conflict between Toussaint and Rigaud, known as the War of the South from 1799 to 1800, revealed how fragile revolutionary unity remained. This was not simply a war of color in any simplistic sense, though race, class, and region all mattered. Rigaud had strong support in the South among many free people of color and local elites. Toussaint controlled broader resources and military strength. The war was brutal and politically consequential. By defeating Rigaud, Toussaint strengthened his dominance over the colony, but he also deepened resentments that would matter later. Revolutions often centralize through internal violence before they can resist external enemies, and Saint-Domingue was no exception. Once Toussaint consolidated control, he moved decisively to reorder the colony. In 1801, he promulgated a constitution for Saint-Domingue. The document maintained the colony's formal connection to France, but made Toussaint governor-general for life and gave the territory wide autonomy in practice. Slavery was permanently abolished. Catholicism was recognized. Administrative structures were regularized. The Constitution was, in effect, the statement of a revolutionary regime that no longer intended to wait passively for metropolitan approval. Toussaint was saying to France and to the world that Saint-Domingue had remade itself and would not be reduced again to a plantation colony governed at the whim of distant men. This was an extraordinary act, but also a dangerous one. Napoleon Bonaparte, by then first consul, had his own plans for French power in the Atlantic. He wanted imperial restoration, discipline, and revenue. He did not regard autonomous black military rule in Saint-Domingue as something to tolerate indefinitely. The colony remained economically and strategically valuable. Moreover, Bonaparte's wider imperial imagination involved reasserting French authority in the Caribbean and the Mississippi Valley. A Saint-Domingue effectively governed by Toussaint under anti-slavery principles and military autonomy fit poorly with this vision. The collision was coming. To understand what happened next, it is essential to remember that Napoleon was not confronting a local disturbance. He was confronting a revolution that had already defeated internal white resistance, forced abolition, outlasted British intervention, and built its own governing structures. Any attempt to reverse that would require immense force and ruthless political intent. In 1802, he sent one of the largest overseas expeditions of the era under his brother-in-law Charles Leclerc. Thousands of veteran troops sailed for Saint-Domingue. The official language spoke of restoring order and French authority. In the colony and across the Atlantic, many suspected the deeper aim, the restoration of slavery and metropolitan control by force. They had reason to suspect it. Around the same time, Napoleon restored slavery in Guadeloupe. Whatever ambiguity might have remained about French intentions began to vanish. The formerly enslaved and their leaders knew what it would mean if French troops reimposed the old plantation order. The memory was too fresh. Freedom had been won through war. It would not be surrendered because Paris preferred a different administrative arrangement. Yet the opening phase of Leclerc's expedition was complicated. Some black and mixed-race generals negotiated, hesitated, or shifted temporarily. Toussaint himself maneuvered, resisting militarily while also exploring accommodations. The politics of the colony remained fragmented, and Napoleon hoped to exploit those divisions. At first, the French had real success. Their forces were large, disciplined, and experienced. They landed at multiple points, took cities, and pressured local leaders. Some of Toussaint's lieutenants submitted or appeared to. Toussaint himself eventually accepted terms, at least formally, in 1802. On paper, this looked like a French recovery, but the paper concealed a deeper failure. The expedition had not truly secured loyalty. It had not solved the colony's fundamental political problem. It had only paused open resistance while fear, mistrust, and observation deepened. Once news and evidence accumulated that French intentions included the restoration of slavery, the colony moved again toward war, this time more uncompromisingly than before. Napoleon's agents then committed one of the defining acts of treachery in the revolutionary Atlantic. Toussaint Louverture, having accepted a settlement, was seized through deception, arrested, and deported to France. This was more than an arrest. It was an imperial attempt to remove the revolution's most formidable brain and symbol in one stroke. If Toussaint could be isolated and eliminated, perhaps the colony could be pacified, its generals divided, its labor disciplined, and its wealth reclaimed. Instead, the act confirmed the worst suspicions of those who had doubted French good faith. Whatever promises had been made, the empire had shown its hand. Toussaint was taken to the Fort de Joux in the Jura Mountains of France, Imprisoned in cold conditions far from the Caribbean, interrogated, denied effective defense, and left to die in 1803. His famous reported words about cutting down only the trunk of the tree of liberty and leaving the roots have become part of revolutionary legend. Whether remembered exactly or not, they capture a truth. The French could capture Toussaint. They could not erase the social revolution he had helped shape. By removing him, they radicalized what remained. Leadership would now pass more fully into the hands of generals like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe, and Alexander Pétion, each with different backgrounds and political instincts, but all increasingly convinced that coexistence with a French empire bent on restoration was impossible. Disease again changed the war's arithmetic. Yellow fever devastated French troops. Caribbean disease environments did not magically win wars on their own. They became decisive only when combined with determined resistance, local knowledge, and the inability of imperial armies to replace losses indefinitely. But their impact was devastating. Leclerc's expedition began with enormous confidence and gradually dissolved under combat, fever, and the realization that Saint-Domingue could not be governed like an ordinary colony after a decade of upheaval. Leclerc himself died in the colony. French command passed to Rochambeau, whose brutality only hardened resistance further. Repression, mass killings, attack dogs, executions, and terror tactics made clear that the struggle had moved beyond any plausible compromise. This would end either in restored slavery under French power or in the destruction of that power. Dessalines emerged in this final phase as the central military leader of the war for independence. If Toussaint had embodied strategic flexibility and statecraft under the French Republican framework, Dessalines increasingly embodied the hard conclusion that no stable freedom was possible under French sovereignty. He had been one of Toussaint's most formidable generals, a man of immense energy and ferocity, feared by enemies and sometimes by allies. Under the pressure of 1802 and 1803, he and other leaders moved from the language of defense of emancipation toward full separation. This was not merely an ideological purification. It was a political deduction drawn from experience. If France under Bonaparte meant to restore slavery, then only independence could secure the revolution's social gains. The struggle became one of annihilating stakes. French forces fought to restore imperial command. Haitian forces fought to ensure that the plantation slave order would never return. In such a war, compromise became almost meaningless. Towns changed hands. Armies maneuvered. The countryside, already scarred by years of conflict, bore renewed devastation. Yet the balance was shifting decisively. The French expedition had been weakened catastrophically by disease and resistance. Britain, once France's great imperial rival in the region and now at war again after the breakdown of the Peace of Amiens, re-entered the strategic picture by blockading and isolating French forces. Saint-Domingue, which Napoleon had hoped to reintegrate into a revived Atlantic empire, was becoming instead the grave of that vision. The final major confrontation at Verdières in November 1803 has become one of the revolution's climactic symbols, though by then the French position was already profoundly undermined. Haitian forces under Dessalines and his commanders pressed their advantage. Verdières demonstrated in compressed form what the revolution had become: black and mixed-race troops, forged through years of shifting warfare, defeating the forces of a European empire sent to restore domination. Within days, the French capitulated and agreed to evacuate. The colony that had once been the jewel of French Atlantic wealth was lost, not to another European state, not to negotiated metropolitan reform, to a revolution born among the enslaved. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines proclaimed independence and restored the island's indigenous-derived name, Haiti. The act was immense in world history. A new state had emerged from the only large-scale slave revolution in the Americas that successfully destroyed slavery and founded an independent nation. This was not the American Revolution, in which slaveholders could declare rights while largely preserving bondage. This was not the French Revolution, whose colonial emancipation had been won under pressure and then threatened with reversal. Haiti represented a break of a different order. People who had been treated as property had defeated the armies of Europe and claimed sovereignty for themselves. Yet the birth of Haiti was neither serene nor uncomplicated. Dessalines and other leaders had come through a decade of unspeakable violence. They had seen betrayal, deportation, plantation burning, racial war, foreign invasion, and repeated proof that white imperial power would kill to restore slavery. The Declaration of Independence thus emerged from a political imagination shaped not by abstract optimism alone, but by terror survived. This matters for understanding what followed, including some of the revolution's darkest choices. One of those choices was the 1804 massacre of many of the remaining white French inhabitants. The event has often been used by hostile observers to reduce the Haitian Revolution to racial revenge, as though it were simply the mirror image of colonial violence. Such readings are shallow and self-serving, but the massacre cannot be wished away. Dessalines and his government, fearing internal subversion and the permanent danger of recolonization, ordered killings that left deep moral scars on the new state's birth. The decision emerged from a context in which white power had been associated with the restoration of slavery and exterminatory violence, and in which the revolution's leaders believed that leaving a French settler presence intact would keep the door open to another imperial return. Explanation is not exoneration, but history becomes useless when it pretends that actions taken in the furnace of revolutionary survival can be understood outside the conditions that produced them. The new Haitian state thus entered the world carrying both emancipation and trauma. Its founders had achieved something no slave regime in the Atlantic thought possible, yet they had done so through a war that had destroyed property, lives, infrastructure, and much of the old export economy. The colony had been one of the richest in the world. The nation that emerged from its ruins faced isolation, hostility, and enormous material difficulty. Independence did not provide a clean slate. It provided sovereignty under siege. The Atlantic response was immediate and revealing. Slaveholding societies trembled. Planters in Jamaica, Cuba, the American South, and beyond saw Haiti not merely as a state, but as a warning. To the enslaved and free black people throughout the Americas, Haiti could look like proof. To slaveholders, it looked like nightmare made real. Information about the revolution traveled in censored, distorted, fearful, or admiring forms depending on who was sending it and why. News of uprisings, black generals, emancipation, and independent rule moved through ships, newspapers, rumor networks, taverns, and plantation whispers. Haiti entered the Atlantic imagination as both beacon and terror. In the United States, the Haitian Revolution intersected with the early republic's own contradictions in powerful ways. American merchants had traded with Saint-Domingue long before independence. American politicians had followed the upheaval anxiously, partly as a matter of commerce and strategy, partly because a republic founded by slaveholders could not watch a slave revolution without dread. Southern slaveholders feared contagion. Federal policymakers worried about European war and Caribbean instability. Black Americans, free and enslaved, watched with a different kind of attention. They saw in Haiti a challenge to the claim that African-descended people were unfit for citizenship, sovereignty, or military discipline. One of the most consequential indirect effects of the Haitian Revolution on the United States was the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon had hoped to rebuild French imperial power in the Caribbean and North America with Saint-Domingue at the center and Louisiana as a provisioning hinterland. Once the expedition to Saint-Domingue collapsed, the value of holding Louisiana changed dramatically. In 1803, he sold the vast territory to the United States. This transaction, often narrated as an American story of opportunity, cannot be fully understood without Haiti. The failure to restore Saint-Domingue helped make French North American ambitions untenable. In this sense, the Haitian Revolution altered the territorial future of the United States itself. The revolution also shook abolitionist politics. In Europe, especially Britain, opponents of the slave trade and slavery confronted a complex reality. Haiti demonstrated the moral horror and political instability of slave systems. It also frightened moderates who saw in slave revolt the possibility of uncontrolled violence. Abolitionists had to argue that slavery itself was the generator of catastrophe, not merely its victims. The British movement against the slave trade gained force in the years after Haiti, culminating in the 1807 abolition of the British slave trade. Haiti was not the sole cause, but it changed the atmosphere in which these debates took place. It made clear that slavery was not a stable institution merely because the powerful wished it to be. For enslaved people elsewhere, Haiti entered the realm of possibility, rumor, prayer, code, and fear. The names of Toussaint, Dessalines, and later Haiti itself circulated in rebellions, conspiracies, and whispered conversations across the Atlantic world. Gabriel's conspiracy in Virginia, the 1811 German coast uprising in Louisiana, Denmark Vesey's alleged conspiracy in Charleston, and many other moments of enslaved or free black resistance unfolded in a world already transformed by the Haitian example. Slaveholders understood this and often inflated or imagined Haitian plots when suppressing black political action, but their fear was grounded in the fact that a revolution they had thought impossible had already happened. The new Haitian leadership faced enormous internal questions as well. Freedom had been won, but what would economic life look like? Many former slaves wanted land, autonomy, family security, and distance from plantation discipline. Leaders who had inherited a shattered export economy often wanted to restore large-scale production, not necessarily through slavery, but through labor systems that could feel coercive to those who had just destroyed slavery. This tension ran through Haitian politics from the start. Independence did not abolish the material problem of how a poor, war-torn nation would survive in a hostile world economy shaped by powers that wanted Haitian failure. Dessalines declared himself Emperor Jacques I in 1804, a move that has often invited comparison with Napoleon and prompted debates about authoritarianism and political symbolism. Some of this comparison is fair. Revolutionary leaders who fight existential wars often centralize power and cloak it in strong forms. But Haitian political forms also emerged from a uniquely precarious environment. The new state faced the constant threat of invasion, racialized non-recognition, economic strangulation, and internal fragmentation. Dessalines' rule reflected both the ambition to stabilize the revolution and the brutal habits formed in years of war. His assassination in 1806 soon fractured the young nation into rival regimes, with Henri Christophe dominant in the north and Alexander Pétion in the south. Haitian unity, won against France, proved harder to sustain internally. These internal divisions should not be mistaken for proof that the revolution had failed. They reveal instead the depth of the social transformation and the difficulty of state building after Revolutionary War. Christophe's northern regime would emphasize order, militarization, and plantation-like labor discipline in pursuit of economic recovery and sovereignty. Pétion's Southern Republic took different paths, including land redistribution that would matter deeply for peasant society. Later, under Jean-Pierre Boyer, Haiti would reunify and even occupy the eastern side of the island for a time. But the basic dilemma remained: how to defend independence, preserve emancipation, and build a viable state under conditions of relentless international hostility. That hostility took many forms. One of the cruelest was diplomatic isolation. Slaveholding powers and European empires were reluctant to recognize Haiti because recognition meant acknowledging that a republic founded by formerly enslaved people existed and could not easily be erased. The United States, despite its own revolutionary self-image, refused to recognize Haiti until 1862. European powers maneuvered more pragmatically, but France in particular insisted on a price for recognition that revealed the deep injustice of the post-revolutionary order. In 1825, under military threat from France, Haiti agreed to an indemnity meant to compensate former French colonists for losses suffered in the revolution, including, obscenely, loss of property in the form of enslaved human beings. The sum was enormous and financially crushing. Haiti, the nation born from the destruction of slavery, was forced to pay former slaveholders for the privilege of being acknowledged as independent. The debt would burden Haitian finances for generations, feeding dependency on foreign credit and constraining development. If the revolution had shattered the plantation order, the indemnity helped create a new kind of punishment: independence taxed by the very world that had tried to prevent it. This is why any honest account of Haiti's later poverty and political instability must begin not with stereotypes of incapacity, but with the extraordinary violence of the context in which the state was born. Haiti emerged from one of the most destructive wars in Atlantic history. It inherited a ravaged landscape, a shattered export apparatus, social divisions formed under slavery and war, and a hostile international system prepared to isolate, punish, and exploit it. None of this erases the responsibilities of Haitian leaders or the complexity of internal politics, but it changes the frame. Haiti did not fail because the revolution was misguided or because black sovereignty was somehow inherently unstable, as racist observers long implied. Haiti struggled because it won a revolution so radical that the surrounding world sought to make its victory unbearably expensive. The Haitian Revolution also transformed the language of freedom. The American Revolution had produced a republic that could celebrate liberty while leaving slavery intact and, in some regions, strengthened. The French Revolution had proclaimed universal rights while hesitating repeatedly over colonial application. Haiti forced a harder proposition into Atlantic politics. What if the people claiming liberty were those whom the age had defined as property? What if the rights of man were taken seriously by those excluded from the category? What if sovereignty itself could be remade not by colonial elites alone, but by the enslaved and their descendants? These were not theoretical provocations. They were now state facts. That is one reason Haiti has often been minimized in global history textbooks. It does not fit comfortably into triumphalist stories of Western modernity. It reveals that universalism was never granted cleanly from above. It had to be seized from below. It exposes the racial boundary conditions built into early modern ideas of freedom, property, and citizenship. It shows that the most radical revolution in the age of revolutions was not necessarily the one most celebrated in imperial memory. To remember Haiti properly is to disturb the easy genealogy in which liberty moves politely from European philosophy to Atlantic progress. Haiti insists that liberty also came armed, black, plantation-scarred, and unwilling to wait for permission. The revolution's military history itself deserves attention as more than backdrop to political ideas. Haitian commanders and soldiers fought with remarkable adaptability. They learned from African military experience, colonial militias, European drill, and the realities of Caribbean terrain. They used mobility, intelligence, negotiation, attrition, local alliances, and the disease environment to devastating effect. They were not merely victims who became insurgents. They became strategic actors in a war that defeated some of the age's most formidable military institutions. The Atlantic world had long assumed that disciplined modern warfare belonged to Europe. Haiti shattered that assumption. Religious and cultural life also mattered profoundly. The revolution cannot be reduced to voodoo, and sensationalizing voodoo as exotic magic has long distorted the story. But neither can one understand the uprising without recognizing the spiritual and communal worlds through which enslaved people made meaning, forged solidarity, and interpreted crisis. Catholicism, African religious practices, and new syncretic forms all shaped how communities understood power, suffering, oath, healing, and destiny. The colonial regime had tried to discipline bodies and souls. The revolution unfolded among people who had retained or recreated moral worlds beyond colonial command. Spiritual life was not a decorative background. It was part of how resistance became imaginable. Language mattered too. Saint-Domingue was multilingual and culturally layered. French was the language of official administration and elite discourse, but Haitian Creole and a range of African languages and memory traditions shaped everyday communication. Revolution required translation, not only across tongues, but across political worlds. When freedom became a military and administrative fact, it had to be explained, enacted, and defended among people who had not entered the struggle with identical understandings of rights, citizenship, or empire. The Haitian Revolution was therefore not just a fight against masters. It was also an immense work of political communication among the oppressed themselves. The environmental history of the revolution should not be ignored either. Saint-Domingue's mountains, plains, forests, roads, rivers, and climate were not passive settings. They shaped campaign movement, plantation vulnerability, maroon refuge, disease ecology, and strategic possibility. European armies accustomed to fighting in other climates found themselves in a landscape that punished them when local resistance was strong enough to deny quick victory. Tropical disease was not a moral ally of the revolution. It was a lethal environmental fact. But the revolution's leaders understood how to survive and fight within that fact better than their enemies did. The environment became part of the balance of power. At the level of political thought, Toussaint Louverture remains one of the age's most fascinating figures because he inhabited contradiction without dissolving into confusion. He fought for black emancipation while maintaining plantation discipline. He served France while building colonial autonomy. He embraced Catholic order, yet moved in a world transformed by slave insurgency. He was capable of harsh repression and also of remarkable statecraft. He was not a liberal hero in the tidy 19th century sense, nor was he merely an opportunist. He was a revolutionary governor trying to build durable freedom in a colony the Atlantic world wanted either profitable or dead. The difficulty of categorizing him is part of his importance. Dessalines, too, resists easy moral flattening. He was capable of brutality that cannot be denied. He also helped carry the revolution through its final anti-colonial phase when compromise had become a path back to slavery. If Toussaint often looks to later generations like the moderating statesman, Dessalines appears as the harder revolutionary edge of a society convinced, with reason, that exterminatory dangers still faced it. The history of the Haitian Revolution cannot be told honestly by choosing one as hero and using the other as cautionary shadow. Both emerged from the same furnace. Both reveal what it meant to make politics under conditions in which defeat threatened the return of slavery. The revolution's effect on race as an Atlantic category was equally profound. Colonial slave societies had built elaborate ideologies around African inferiority, black incapacity for self-rule, and white indispensability to order and civilization. Haiti demolished these claims in practice. That did not end racism. In some ways it sharpened it, because systems of domination often become more explicit when contradicted by reality. But the revolution shattered any honest claim that black people were incapable of military command, political thought, diplomatic action, or national self-government. Racism after Haiti had to work harder, deny more, and fear more because the evidence against it was now a sovereign state. This is one reason the memory of Haiti was so contested in the 19th century. Black abolitionists and activists often invoked the revolution as proof of black political capacity and as indictment of slavery. White historians and politicians frequently minimized, demonized, or pathologized it. European observers oscillated between fascination and horror. Caribbean planters used Haiti as a warning in both directions, as a warning against mistreating the enslaved and as a warning about what emancipation might unleash. Memory of the revolution became part of the struggle over its meaning. In the Caribbean itself, Haiti's existence changed geopolitics. Cuba, under Spanish rule, expanded its own plantation economy in part within the vacuum left by Saint-Domingue's destruction as a sugar giant. This bitter irony matters. The collapse of one slave regime did not collapse all others. Market demand shifted. Other colonies intensified production, often with renewed ferocity. The Haitian Revolution, therefore, did not abolish Atlantic slavery by example alone. It transformed the system unevenly. It destroyed one of its greatest centers and frightened the rest, but it also redistributed opportunity to rival slave economies. History is not morally tidy enough to allow one revolution to purify the whole market it disrupted. And yet Haiti's significance does not depend on immediate universal emancipation. Its importance lies in what it made newly thinkable and permanently undeniable. A slave revolution could do more than terrify. It could found. It could govern. It could defeat empires. It could produce constitutions, armies, diplomacy, and a state. It could force the Atlantic powers to reorganize around its existence. It could alter other revolutions indirectly. It could open new forms of political imagination among the oppressed. That is enough to make it one of the central events of the modern world. The phrase, the slave uprising that shook the Atlantic, is therefore not rhetorical excess. The Atlantic world really was shaken. Trade routes, imperial strategies, planter confidence, abolitionist arguments, American territorial expansion, French colonial ambition, and racial ideology all shifted under the impact. Some shifts were immediate. Others were slow. Some were liberatory. Others were punitive. But the shock was real. Once Saint-Domingue became Haiti, the Atlantic could never quite think about slavery the same way again. even where slavery persisted for decades. There is a temptation, especially in commemorative storytelling, to smooth the revolution into inevitability. That temptation should be resisted. The Haitian Revolution was contingent at every stage. It could have been crushed earlier. It could have fractured permanently among competing leaders. France might have restored more effective control had disease and war broken differently. Britain might have secured parts of the colony longer. Internal rivalries might have consumed the insurgent cause before independence emerged. The revolution was not destined to win simply because its cause was morally stronger. It won because thousands of people fought, organized, endured, negotiated, and adapted with extraordinary skill under conditions that killed huge numbers and left almost no room for error. Its human cost was immense. Plantations burned. Cities were contested. Massacres occurred. Families were separated. Disease consumed soldiers and civilians alike. Hunger and displacement followed campaigns. The revolution's victory does not erase the suffering through which it passed. The challenge of telling Haitian history responsibly is to hold emancipation and devastation together. The triumph was real. So was the ruin. The state that emerged had been born through one of the most violent and transformative struggles in the history of the Atlantic world. Even after independence, the logic of plantation power haunted debates over labor and land. Some leaders believed export agriculture on large estates remained essential to national survival. Many former slaves preferred small-scale farming, local autonomy, and freedom from plantation command. Out of this tension emerged much of Haiti's later rural social structure. The revolution had destroyed slavery, but it had not resolved the conflict between state revenue and peasant autonomy. Nor could it do so easily in a hostile world market. Rural Haitians often defended freedom through control of time, family, land use, and distance from plantation coercion. Elites often interpreted this as backwardness or indiscipline. Historians now see it more clearly as a political choice rooted in the memory of slavery. The revolution also had an intellectual afterlife that extended far beyond the Caribbean. 19th-century thinkers, from abolitionists to black nationalists to anti-colonial writers, would return to Haiti as a source of argument. Frederick Douglass later, as U.S. Minister to Haiti, would speak of its world historical significance. C.L.R. James in the 20th century would make the revolution intellectually unavoidable for modern readers by placing it squarely at the center of the age of revolution rather than at its margins. Contemporary scholarship has deepened and complicated the picture further, but the basic corrective remains the same. Haiti was never peripheral to modernity. It was one of the places where modernity's claims were tested most radically. If we ask, then, what the Haitian Revolution ultimately changed, the answer is not singular. It changed empire by demonstrating that one of the richest colonies in the world could be lost to the people it had enslaved. It changed slavery by making elite confidence in its permanence much harder to sustain. It changed race by disproving in action some of the central fictions of white supremacy. It changed the Americas by shaping the territorial future of the United States and the economic future of the Caribbean. It changed political thought by forcing universal rights to answer to those they had excluded. And it changed memory by leaving the Atlantic world with a revolution too significant to ignore and too unsettling to assimilate comfortably. That discomfort remains. Haiti is often invoked through disaster, poverty, or instability in modern media, as though its history were merely a string of tragic failures. Such portrayals flatten the foundational violence done to the country by slavery, war, isolation, indemnity, and foreign exploitation. They also obscure the most important fact. Haiti exists because enslaved people carried out one of the most successful and transformative revolutions in human history. Every later difficulty unfolded after that achievement, not instead of it. The existence of Haiti is itself evidence that the old Atlantic certainties could be broken. The revolution's founders could not solve everything they unleashed. No founders ever do. But they did solve one question with irrevocable force: whether a society built on slavery could be overthrown by those enslaved within it. The answer was yes. And once that answer existed, every slave society in the Atlantic had to live differently, think differently, fear differently, and police differently. Every movement for abolition had new evidence. Every claim about black incapacity had new contradiction. Every empire had a new wound in its imagination. In the end, the Haitian Revolution is not only the story of Saint-Domingue becoming Haiti. It is the story of the Atlantic world discovering that the people it had tried to reduce to labor and property were capable of making history on the largest scale. The planters had built a machine of sugar and death. The revolutionaries turned that machine into a furnace in which a new state was forged. They did not inherit a nation. They made one. They did not receive freedom as an imperial gift. They fought for it, and then had to defend it against those who insisted it should never have existed. This is why the revolution still matters so much. It compels us to ask what modern freedom means when the people who claim it were never meant to be recognized as fully human by the societies around them. It asks what happens when universal rights are spoken by those denied them. It asks what sovereignty looks like when it rises not from colonial elites alone, but from the enslaved, the armed, the dispossessed, and the politically inventive. It asks whether the modern world can tell the truth about itself without placing Haiti near the center. The answer, if we are honest, is no. You cannot understand the age of revolutions without Haiti. You cannot understand Atlantic slavery's instability without Haiti. You cannot understand the history of black freedom struggles without Haiti. You cannot understand the distance between revolutionary principle and social reality without Haiti. The Haitian Revolution did not merely join the modern world. It forced the modern world to look at itself more honestly than it wanted to. The richest slave colony in the Atlantic became the first black republic. The uprising that slaveholders imagined only as nightmare became a nation. The people the plantation system treated as expendable became the makers of one of the most consequential victories in modern history. That is not a footnote. That is the story. And once you see it clearly, the whole Atlantic age looks different. Before moving further into aftermath, it is worth pausing on something often lost in broad retellings. The Haitian Revolution had a deep underground before it had a government, an army hierarchy, or a declaration of independence. The colony had long produced figures of resistance whom planters remembered with disproportionate fear. One of the most famous was Francois McCandle, associated in colonial memory with maroon networks and poisoning panics decades before the Great Uprising. Whether every colonial tale about him was true is less important than what those tales reveal. Saint-Domingue's rulers had always known that beneath the surface of obedience lay another politics, one of flight, conspiracy, healing knowledge, clandestine movement, and the possibility that the plantation might be attacked not only from outside, but from within its daily life. The revolution did not invent that subterranean world. It emerged from it, magnified it, and gave it continental consequence. Maroon communities, too, mattered in ways that exceed simple romantic image. Runaways who escaped plantations did not all join large hidden settlements, and many forms of maroonage were temporary, strategic, or local. But maroon life proved something fundamental. The plantation regime could be escaped, challenged, or lived around, however precariously. The knowledge of terrain, survival, secrecy, and mobility accumulated by runaways contributed to a wider anti-plantation repertoire. In a colony built on surveillance, anyone who could vanish into the landscape or move through it beyond planter control represented both practical and symbolic danger. The Haitian Revolution, in its early guerrilla and insurgent phases, benefited from this accumulated knowledge of evasion and counter-control. It is also necessary to remember the African worlds carried into Saint-Domingue. The enslaved population was not culturally blank material shaped only by plantation discipline. Many captives had direct experience of warfare, statecraft, religious systems, and social organization in West and Central Africa. They brought military memory, spiritual frameworks, political assumptions, and interpersonal networks that did not disappear at embarkation. The Middle Passage shattered lives and communities, but it did not erase history. When large-scale uprising became possible in Saint-Domingue, participants were not inventing political capacity from nothing. They were drawing on repertoires of command, oath, kinship, and force that had origins long before the colony. This does not mean the revolution was simply African in any essential way. It means the Atlantic system never fully controlled the people it moved. Toussaint Louverture's own life illustrates this complexity. Born into slavery, likely on the Breda plantation, later manumitted, He occupied a position that gave him unusual access to literacy, horses, administration, and broader observation. He was not representative of the average enslaved laborer, and that matters. Revolutions are not made only by the average. They are often shaped by figures who stand at social crossroads. Toussaint knew plantation order from inside, not from the perspective of the whip alone, but also from the perspective of management, negotiation, and daily functioning. That knowledge would later make him especially formidable. He understood how the colony worked because he had lived within its mechanisms at multiple levels. His religiosity also deserves serious attention. Toussaint was a practicing Catholic, and his political language often reflected providential conviction, moral discipline, and a sense that authority needed ethical as well as military legitimacy. This did not make him gentle. It made him legible to multiple audiences at once. He could speak to French officials in the language of order, law, and Republican service, while also commanding the respect of fighters who had come through insurgency and emancipation. His correspondence reveals not only strategic intelligence, but a deep interest in legitimacy. He wanted to be recognized as more than a rebel commander. He wanted to appear as a statesman, and in many respects he was one. But he was a statesman born in a slave revolution, and that set hard limits on what kind of order he could build. His labor policies after the abolition of slavery remain among the most debated aspects of his rule. He believed, or at least acted on the belief, that the colony had to resume disciplined plantation production to survive. Workers were often required to remain on plantations and labor under military-style supervision for wages or shares rather than as slaves. To defenders of Toussaint, this was a harsh but necessary compromise with economic reality in a war-torn export colony. To critics, it reveals how freedom could be constrained by the state in the very moment it was being proclaimed. Both views capture part of the truth. Emancipation in Haiti did not instantly dissolve the plantation as an economic unit. It transformed the terms under which labor and power could be organized, but not without conflict. That conflict surfaced repeatedly in relations between revolutionary leaders and the rural masses. The men who governed often worried about revenue, defense, and international trade. Many laborers worried about autonomy, family, and never returning to anything resembling plantation life. This tension shaped not only Toussaint's era but the post-independence state. The Haitian peasantry that would later become so central to the nation's social reality emerged partly through these struggles over land and labor. People carved spaces of freedom not simply in constitutions, but in settlement patterns, cultivation choices, and resistance to top-down discipline. A revolution founded in the destruction of slavery produced a population profoundly suspicious of any system that smelled like its return, even if administrators called it necessary modernization. When Leclerc's expedition arrived in 1802, it encountered not one homogeneous revolutionary society, but a political landscape full of bruised alliances and unresolved tensions. Some generals had reasons to distrust Toussaint. Some local populations were exhausted by war and willing to test French promises. Some free people of color hoped for a renewed French connection without slavery. Some whites still dreamed of restoration. This complexity explains why the French initially made headway. Empires often re-enter fractured spaces by exploiting local grievances rather than overwhelming every opponent at once. Leclerc's strategy depended on dividing, offering terms, promising to preserve liberty where convenient, and isolating the most intransigent. For a moment, that seemed plausible, but the expedition also suffered from a blindness common to imperial projects. It believed that authority could be restored through command structures and military pressure without accounting for the moral knowledge accumulated by those who had lived the last decade. The formerly enslaved knew what restoration meant. They knew what happened in places where planters regained confidence. They watched Guadeloupe. They saw how quickly French rhetoric could shift when metropolitan priorities changed. In such a context, trust was almost impossible. The French needed the colony to believe that black freedom would remain secure under renewed metropolitan rule. Their wider imperial behavior made that belief irrational. Rochambeau's conduct after Leclerc's death helped strip away any residual ambiguity. His name has become associated with some of the most infamous atrocities of the war's final phase: executions, terror tactics, and the use of dogs imported to attack black fighters. Again, Colonial apologists have sometimes tried to isolate these acts as personal excess, but they belong to a deeper imperial logic. Once France recognized that Saint-Domingue might be lost unless slavery and white authority were forcibly restored, the temptation toward exterminatory violence was built into the project. The people defending freedom understood this. The war became, in their eyes and with good reason, not simply a contest over allegiance, but a struggle against re-enslavement backed by massacre. Dessalines' wartime rhetoric reflected that understanding. His proclamations and later policies are full of insistence that French colonialism and black freedom could not coexist safely. To those who wish revolutions would remain morally clean, such rhetoric can sound terrifying. But it emerged from a history in which compromise had repeatedly meant vulnerability. Revolutionary leaders in Saint-Domingue had negotiated, shifted alliances, and accepted formal terms before. Each time, the possibility of re-enslavement or imperial domination returned. By 1803, the argument for absolute separation had been written not only in ideology, but in blood. Haiti's Declaration of Independence itself is worth reading not simply as a state document, but as a record of historical memory under pressure. It does not sound like the serene universalism of 1776 in North America. It sounds like a people who have lived through betrayal, genocide-threatening war, and the constant prospect of chains. Its insistence that Haiti must not permit colonial domination to return is not decorative rhetoric. It is the core lesson drawn from the previous decade. In that sense, Haiti's founding language may be closer to the emotional truth of revolutionary violence than many more polished declarations. It does not pretend that empire can be escaped by words alone. The 1805 Haitian Constitution carries that same intensity. It abolished slavery permanently, defined all citizens as black in a political rather than simply phenotypical sense, and sought to prevent the re-emergence of the old racial order. This has sometimes puzzled readers unfamiliar with the revolutionary context. Why define the citizenry this way in a society that clearly contained color and ancestry differences? Because the Constitution was repudiating the colonial categories through which race had structured hierarchy. Black became a political identity of the formerly dominated, confronting a world of white empire. It was an act of protective redefinition. The Constitution also barred most whites from property ownership, with limited exceptions. Again, one may debate the ethics or consequences, but the logic cannot be separated from the experience of colonization and attempted re-enslavement. The relationship between Haiti and the eastern side of Hispaniola after independence adds another layer to the story. The island had never been a simple unity, and Spanish Santo Domingo had its own colonial trajectories, economic structures, and political tensions. Haitian leaders, especially under Boyer, would later occupy the eastern side partly from strategic concerns and partly from their broader anti-slavery commitments. Those events belong to a later chapter, but they matter because they show that the Haitian Revolution did not end cleanly at the shoreline of the old French colony. The island remained a contested political space, shaped by the aftershocks of emancipation and empire. The Haitian Revolution also changed how European empires thought about colonial troops and black military capacity. Before Haiti, European powers routinely used black and mixed-race soldiers in colonial contexts while assuming command remained properly white and metropolitan. Haiti did more than demonstrate black battlefield competence. It demonstrated black command at the highest level under revolutionary conditions. That example could not be erased. It had to be managed, denied, or racially reinterpreted by imperial observers, but it remained. When later black soldiers and anti-colonial leaders claimed military and political capability, Haiti existed as precedent. The emotional force of precedent should not be underestimated. Historical possibility is a real political resource. Before Haiti, slaveholders could say that mass enslaved revolt leading to stable independent statehood was fantasy. After Haiti, they could no longer say it honestly. They could say it was dangerous. They could say it was monstrous. They could say it must be prevented at any cost. But impossibility was gone. That shift in the realm of possibility is one of the revolution's greatest legacies. It also helps explain why suppression of Haitian history became so attractive to dominant powers. A revolution that remains imaginable can continue to inspire long after its immediate leaders are dead. The easiest way to disarm it is to minimize it, isolate it, or narrate it as mere chaos rather than as political creation. For generations, mainstream histories of the Atlantic world did exactly that. They gave lavish treatment to the American and French revolutions while reducing Haiti to a violent sidebar or treating it as a derivative reaction rather than a foundational event. This was not an accident of scholarly taste. It reflected deeper political discomfort with the meanings Haiti forced into view. What did Haiti force into view? First, that slavery was not just morally abhorrent, but politically unstable at its core. Second, that the enslaved were not passive recipients of metropolitan reform. Third, that empire and universal rights could coexist only through hypocrisy until challenged from below. Fourth, that black sovereignty was not a contradiction in terms except to racially ordered political thought. Fifth, that the modern Atlantic world was made not only by merchants, philosophers, and legislators, but by people who had been denied personhood and then seized history by force. These lessons traveled differently depending on who was listening. For black communities in the Americas, Haiti could represent pride, courage, proof, and sometimes a spiritual horizon. For white elites, it often represented fear. For abolitionists, it represented both argument and warning. Argument against slavery's defenders, warning about what delayed justice might produce. For imperial strategists, it represented a colonial disaster to be studied and not repeated. For historians, it ought to represent the impossibility of telling modern freedom as a purely European gift. The economic afterlife of the revolution has sometimes been narrated too simplistically as a fall from prosperity into ruin, as if the destruction of Saint-Domingue's plantation wealth itself proved the revolution tragic or misguided. That framing accepts plantation wealth as the natural standard. But Saint-Domingue had been rich because it was monstrously exploitative. The relevant question is not why post-revolutionary Haiti failed to reproduce the same wealth curves, but what kinds of life, autonomy, and political survival its people were trying to secure after overthrowing the social machinery that had produced those curves. This does not mean economic difficulties were trivial. They were severe. It means the moral baseline must change. A society no longer generating extraordinary profits from slave labor may look poorer in export statistics while being infinitely less monstrous in human terms. Even so, Haitian leaders could not ignore international commerce. Coffee exports continued. State revenue mattered. Military defense required resources. Foreign recognition was tied to trade and diplomacy. Haiti's economy after independence was therefore pulled between local peasant priorities and state-level needs. The resulting tensions shaped 19th-century Haitian politics profoundly. Observers who later dismissed the country as disorganized often failed to see that much of what they called disorder was actually conflict over what emancipation should mean socially and economically. Should freedom mean disciplined labor in service of state power and export recovery? Or should it mean local autonomy, even at the cost of diminished centralized capacity? That question did not have an easy answer in a hostile Atlantic world. The revolution's place in French memory is equally revealing. France could celebrate liberty, equality, and fraternity in Europe while struggling to assimilate the fact that the most radical application of those ideas in the colonial world had resulted in the loss of a prized colony and the destruction of slavery there. The Haitian Revolution exposed the colonial limit of French universalism. It showed that metropolitan principles often depended on imperial exceptions. This is one reason French memory of Haiti has oscillated between neglect, discomfort, and selective recovery. To center Haiti is to admit that the French Revolution's colonial story cannot be told as a clean extension of rights from Paris outward. British memory has its own evasions. Britain likes to remember abolition as a parliamentary and humanitarian achievement, and indeed British abolitionism accomplished much. But Haiti complicates this self-image by reminding us that the Atlantic slave system was also undermined by enslaved people acting for themselves, not merely by sympathetic legislators. British imperial decision-making regarding the slave trade, emancipation, and colonial security cannot be separated from the fear and example generated by Saint-Domingue. Parliamentary reform and slave revolt were not identical, but neither were they separate universes. Haiti shaped the field within which British moral and strategic calculations were made. In the Caribbean, the The revolution became both a source of inspiration and a vocabulary of repression. Colonial authorities repeatedly invoked another Haiti to justify harsher surveillance, militia readiness, censorship, and preemptive punishment. The very name of the new state became politically active even where people knew little of its internal details. That is how powerful an example can be. It does not need to be fully understood to matter. It only needs to prove that a door once thought sealed has been opened somewhere. And still, despite all this, Haiti was never simply a symbol. It was, and is, a society full of people living after revolution, not a perpetual emblem for others. That distinction matters. When outsiders use Haiti only as proof of terror or proof of liberation, they can flatten the actual country into somebody else's argument. The revolution's descendants had to live with the consequences of the founding long after the Atlantic world had taken its lesson. They built villages, farmed land, raised children, fought over constitutions, carried debts, served in armies, entered churches and voodoo spaces, argued over presidents and emperors, and kept the nation alive under conditions many stronger states would have struggled to bear. The endurance of Haiti after 1804 is itself a second story too often overshadowed by the drama of the revolution. What, then, should we remember most? Perhaps this. The Haitian Revolution was the most successful revolt of enslaved people in history, not simply because it overthrew masters, but because it forced the surrounding world to reorganize around the fact of its success. It was not an episode that ended at victory. It kept acting on other histories. The United States expanded partly in the space opened by Napoleon's failure in Saint-Domingue. Slaveholders intensified repression in response to Haitian example. Abolitionists sharpened arguments in a world where slavery's fragility had been exposed. Black political thought everywhere acquired a new horizon. Colonial powers learned fear. Historians inherited a challenge. That challenge remains. To tell the Haitian Revolution honestly is to reject the comforting story that modern liberty developed in a straight line from enlightened minds to improved institutions. Haiti says otherwise. Haiti says liberty was also made in cane fields, maroon camps, burning plantations, fever wards, military councils, and declarations written by people the Atlantic Order had designated unfit for freedom. Haiti says the modern world was forced open from below, as well as argued into being from above. It is difficult to imagine a more world-changing reversal. The colony that had once epitomized the wealth of slavery became the state that most powerfully exposed slavery's vulnerability. The people treated as inventory became a nation. The empire that expected obedience encountered revolution. The Atlantic system that had priced human beings in ledgers found itself confronted by people who refused the ledger's authority. That is why the Haitian Revolution still feels charged more than 2 centuries later. It did not merely replace rulers. It made the entire Atlantic world answer a question it had long evaded. What happens when those at the bottom of the system decide not to remain there? The answer, in Haiti, was history remade.